First things first, as you can tell, I fixed my camera, or more appropriately, my camera lens. Second thing second, you also might have noticed that I did not get my defensive line or defensive back rankings out before this mock draft. And if you've been around this channel for a while, you know that is a character flaw of mine, that I tend to bite off more than I can chew, and I vastly underestimate how long certain projects are going to take. And the old me, when I used to be doing this channel by myself and doing all of the scripting and editing, everything just as a one-man band, I probably would have done 3 all-nighters in a row and not slept for a week in order to get everything out, or at least as close to everything as I possibly could. But now that I have an editor working for me, hello Slater, and kind of a team around me in general helping me to make content, I never want to put people through the same shit that I went through when I was doing everything solo. I have no intention of making people destroy their bodies on my behalf for some YouTube videos. So I made an executive decision where I said, we're going to handle defensive line and defensive back after the draft. And, you know, after we kind of figure out where they're going to go in the draft, we can kind of give some added context about how they're going to be used in their new systems, in addition to kind of giving, you know, my thoughts on them as talents and, you know, where I rank them pre-draft. So yes, I apologize for not having rankings videos for those position groups, but I'm not going to put my editors through what I used to do myself. It's not good. So with that being said, we're just going to do the mock draft today. You know the rules by now if you've been around for a long time. We've been doing these for many years at this point, because this channel's been around for a while. We're doing all 32 picks in the first round, no trades. That's kind of a policy of mine, no trades, even though we expect there to be a lot of trades. And also, probably my most important rule out of all of them, if you are new here, what kind of sets my mock apart from many others is I don't try to predict where these players are going to go, because that's pretty much pointless. Nobody knows where they're going to go. And instead, I pick based on my own rankings, my own evaluations, and I make every single pick in the first round as if I was the general manager, and I'm taking contracts into account, I'm taking scheme fits, I'm taking, obviously, talent, everything that I can possibly pull together into a total profile, I'm going to use to make these picks specifically tailored for every single team. It's not just generic. They need a defensive end, so I'm giving them a defensive end. I'm going to give them the right defensive end for what we know about their systems. So that's why I tend to only do one mock draft a year, and why it tends to be extraordinarily long, because there's a lot of nuance to this mock, and hopefully you'll kind of sit tight and stick with me for the next however long this is going to be, because yeah, it's the biggest episode of the year. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to jump right into it and get to our first overall pick, which is held once again this year by the Jacksonville Jaguars. Allow me to first preface by saying that if I was actually predicting this pick, I would predict that Aiden Hutchinson is going to go first overall. But since I myself am making this pick as kind of a mock GM here, I lean more towards Travon Walker. And I know that sounds insane to a lot of people because of quote-unquote lack of production, but keep in mind that just looking at the Georgia system as a whole, Travon Walker was still the most productive pass rusher on the best defense in the country. He didn't lead them in sacks per se. Their top 2 sack getters were actually 2 inside linebackers, Channing Tindall and Nakobe Dean. But when you look at how that defense was structured, they were kind of funneling a lot of their sacks as a team into those linebackers. Their first and second down defense was all about stopping the run and kind of, you know, spilling everything out to the edges where Dean and Tindall and Quay Walker could clean up. And then on third down, it was a lot of stunts, it was a lot of blitzes, you know, a lot of simulated pressures in order to get these linebackers as free as much as humanly possible so that they could get all of the numbers. Believe it or not, if you just look at 3rd and 5+ situations where there were no blitzes and no stunts anywhere on the front, like just a straight up 4-man rush, Travon Walker only had 37 snaps of those straight up rush scenarios the entire year. They just didn't really let him rush like I think he's capable of, and they were mostly using him as a setup man for everybody else. And I don't really hold that against him, and I think it's a little bit misguided to hold that against him, because when you look at how he's built athletically and the length and the fluidity, you know, there's just nothing that tells me that he can't eventually be a phenomenal pass rusher that wins a whole bunch of one-on-ones. He just doesn't know how to do it yet because of the defense he played in. When you look at every other aspect of his game, though, I mean, he's as pro-ready as it comes. He is arguably the best run defender at any position in this entire draft. They would drop him into coverage and he would get PBUs. Like, he is just a phenomenal football player that unfortunately did not play for a team that let him kind of round out his skill set. So hopefully I laid out my case properly here and kind of showed why a lot of the stats you see on Twitter have been a little bit misleading. I think he's a really good player. So with that being said, let's get to pick number 2 and the Detroit Lions. I know that I did make the case for Malik Willis to Detroit at 2nd overall a few days ago when I did my quarterback rankings, but I want to reiterate a lot of my points here because I do ultimately think he's a perfect fit. And honestly, if I was doing a predictive mock, I would also predict him going 2nd overall because I think the Lions are just as high on him as I am. I personally do not think it was a coincidence at all that he ended up on their roster at Senior Bowl. Remember, the Lions did coach him in Mobile for that week. And just kind of knowing what I know about the business, that doesn't feel like it was an accident. I think that was done on purpose because they wanted to spend a week with him and get to know him. I know that, they were watching a lot of his games throughout the season. They were one of the teams that if you look around on Twitter and you can kind of, take note of what scouts are at what games throughout the season, Lions scouts were showing up a lot at Liberty, and I think they've been interested in Malik Willis for a long time, and how could you not be? He's got a phenomenal arm, he's crazy athletic, I think he's a really good kid, even though, he was in an offense that I don't think did him any favors. There was virtually no talent around him at all, so he did get into a lot of bad habits, but I do think that ultimately, in kind of the new age of the NFL, you look at tools, and you look at the person who has those tools, and you gamble on talent plus coachability. If you just look at talent plus willingness to learn, willingness to be coached, willingness to grow, I think Malik Willis is the best package of that in this draft. And when it comes to his fit specifically with Detroit, luckily for him, he doesn't have to play in 2022, which is great for him because he's not ready to play. Jared Goff is going to be able to start every single game, God willing, unless he gets hurt. And the contract is pretty easy to get out of for 2023. So I think it's a pretty easy to project scenario of Goff, kind of moving on from Detroit when his contract becomes very easily cuttable, I guess is the right word for it. And then you just slide Malik on in there behind, in my opinion, a very talented young offensive line where they've made a lot of investments over the last few years in that position group. I think they're making some pretty quality investments in terms of weapons. You got DeAndre Swift, who I love at running back. You've got a really good tight end group. You've got some young receivers that I really like in DJ Chark and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And obviously there's a lot of room to add to that in this draft as well. I think it's pretty easy, in my opinion, to kind of get behind Malik going at 2nd overall, knowing he's not going to play. You use the 32nd pick on another receiver, whoever's kind of left over from that first group, because there's a million of them in this class. And then for the rest of the draft, you're just going best player available. I think at that point, again, you got protection, you got weapons, you got a young quarterback that's going to be able to sit there and learn behind Jared Goff. You can just kind of take whoever's there for the rest of the draft and feel good about it. So I think ultimately 2nd overall, the best way Detroit can start is with Malik Willis. And then for the entire rest of the weekend, they just let the draft come to them and take whoever the best player left on the board is. And with that, let's get to a pick that is unfortunately near and dear to my heart, and that is going to be the Houston Texans at 3rd overall.
I know my destiny.
I think it's no secret that there are a lot of issues at the very top of the Texans organization right now, and I mean at the very top. But I think that there's also a lot of positive things going on in Houston as well that maybe don't get the same amount of press. For starters, their locker room culture, believe it or not, is pretty damn good. Like, they kind of prioritize team first guys that work really hard, and we can debate the merits of going after culture more than talent. I kind of think that there needs to be a mix of both there, and they're kind of leaning all the way in one direction. But that being said, I do think that there are a few guys in this class that kind of check both boxes of being very talented players that also bring a lot of good things to a locker room. So just kind of seeing how the board fell with the first 2 picks here, I think that Aiden Hutchinson to Houston is a no-brainer pick. because not only does he fill a need, because they do need more pass rush help, but he has also been called, kind of the long-lost Watt brother in terms of locker room presence. Like, he's a phenomenal leader. Everybody that's ever been around him absolutely loves him. He's great for the community. He's a really good dude in terms of how he handles the media. Like, I just think that he is the absolute perfect situation for Houston right now in terms of getting a true star player that also happens to be squeaky clean in every possible way. I'm not saying that he's JJ Watt, of course, because he is not the athlete that JJ was when he was coming out of Wisconsin. But if we're just looking for a player and a presence that a city can rally around, I just love Aiden Hutchinson to Houston here. I think he is immediately going to be one of the best players, if not the best player on the team. And he's also probably going to be a locker room leader by the end of his rookie season. He's just kind of built like that. So if Houston gets lucky enough where, let's say Trent Baalke wins the argument in the Jags front office and they go Trayvon Walker, and then we got Detroit taking Malik Willis like I expect. If Houston does get lucky enough and Aiden Hutchinson is there at 3rd overall, you might as well have him book his flight to Houston because he's not going to make it past them. I almost guarantee you they will take him if he's available. So that pick is pretty easy for me to make for a multitude of reasons. Why don't we get to one that is slightly harder for me to figure out, and that is going to be what the Jets do at 4th overall. I'll be honest, I went back and forth between Jameson Williams and Drake London for a really long time for the Jets, and I could make a valid argument for either of them. But ultimately, I did settle on Williams because I kind of feel like he provides a little bit more of a rare dimension than what London does. Obviously, London would be great with Zach Wilson because he's a 50-50 artist, and Wilson loves to throw those lobs outside the numbers, and they would be phenomenal together. But I also think that if they did kind of want to fill that role, they could probably get a big-bodied jump ball guy later in the draft. But I don't think that there is another Jameson Williams later in the draft. Like, I think if you're going to take him, you got to do it here because he's not going to make it another 4 picks. Don't get me wrong, there are other fast receivers in this class, but nobody is quite like Jameson Williams. In terms of the overall package of route running and yak skills and ball tracking ability, and of course just raw acceleration, he is kind of his own unique receiver in this class. Like, there's other guys that run 4.3. There's even guys that run 4.2. Like, Tyquan Thornton is really, really fast. But even he, I can't quite put him in that Jameson Williams category because the acceleration and the yak ability is just different. Supposedly, Williams is recovering nicely from that ACL. I have no idea if he's going to be ready for training camp. I would expect that, maybe they kind of ease him into things and he's not getting full-time reps until halfway through the season. But I'm kind of playing the long game here. If the Jets can just survive the first 6 to 8 games with Williams either not being back or only partially being back, and if they can just go like 500 in the first half of the season, and then you have a full-power Jameson Williams in the back half of the season, now I think that we could actually be looking at kind of a late-season surge that's tough to deal with. I know it's hard to project playoffs, especially in a loaded AFC, but I mean, just look at the talent on this roster. The offensive line is really good. I think the receiving core is, again, they're only down like one piece in the receiving core, and I think Jameson Williams is it. I think the running back room looks good. I think tight end looks good. They made good signings. I really like Zach Wilson's talent. We'll see if he can kind of take that, second year step that other guys have taken in recent years. But there's really no excuse why the Jets can't be a team that nobody wants to play from October onward. In my opinion, they just need that one dynamic piece that can allow them to go toe-to-toe with all of these explosive teams that can score quickly. I'm looking at the Chargers, I'm looking at the Bills, I'm looking at the Bengals, obviously. Like, all of them can score in 4 plays. And I think if you inject Jameson Williams into that Jets roster, all of a sudden they can score in 4 plays too. Maybe it's my hottest hot take of this whole mock draft, but they're really not that far away. If you give them Jameson Williams and he comes back even at 85 to 90% of what he was for the back half of the season, they're going to do damage. I can promise you that. And they're going to do a lot of damage. So sign me up for Jameson Williams at 4th overall. I think it's a great fit. I think he is definitely a worthy talent of going in the top 5. And why don't we round off the top 5, now that I mention it, with the other team from New York, the Giants. There has been a lot of debate about which tackle the Giants are going to take somewhere in the top 5 to 7 picks. We know they're going to take at least one of them. It would be stupid for them not to. Personally, for me, I kind of lean more towards the Evan Neal side of the argument than I do for Charles Cross or Ike Ekwonu, even though I totally understand why Cross has his supporters and why Ekwonu has his supporters. For me, I do think that Evan Neal is the best combination of being ready to play while also having a just insane physical upside. Plus, also kind of when you look at their starting offensive line right now, they don't really need left tackle, they more need right tackle, and Evan Neal does have experience at right tackle. You don't really have to train him how to do it, whereas I think Cross, it might take a little bit of getting used to because he's used to playing on the left side. Same thing for Ike Ekwonu, even though Ekwonu could probably play guard just fine as well. Anyway, I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here. I think that Evan Neal, we've seen significant snaps of him at right tackle, and he was just as dominant over there as he was at left. So I think it's just a pretty easy projection to make. Not to mention the fact that he's 6'7", 330, and moves like he's 295. He is just an exceptional athlete. He's got length. He's got power. There are some technical things, obviously, that I think he could clean up. I do think that his hands are a little bit vulnerable. I think he kind of leaves them hanging out there, and I think more savvy NFL rushers are going to find a way to disarm him a little bit more easily. But that being said, he is working with Duke Manyweather, who kind of specializes in training independent hand usage and how to protect yourself from these edge rushers. So that probably won't be that big of an issue in the long run. Either way, just kind of looking at his overall athletic profile, looking at his experience at multiple positions, and just exemplary tape at both of them, I really like Evan Neal as a top 5 pick. I think he's a value here, and at least for me, if we're not taking quarterback, we still have to make Daniel Jones as successful as we can, because if he can't succeed this year, we're in trouble. So just kind of give him as much protection as we can and as many weapons as we can. And if it doesn't work, next year's quarterback class is at least really, really good on paper from what we know right now, so we can kind of address that in a year. But for now, we got to give Daniel Jones the best possible chance to work out. And to me, that means drafting Evan Neal. And of course, this will not be the only tackle taken inside the top 10. I don't think we'll have to wait long for the next one to go off the board, because I have another tackle going at 6th overall to the Panthers. In the absence of the Panthers trading up for Malik Willis, which I do think is a distinct possibility, by the way, I don't think it will happen because I think the Jaguars would probably prefer to stick and pick with one of these edge guys. But hey, if the Panthers get desperate and they offer a package of picks, it wouldn't surprise me if they try to jump Detroit for Malik Willis. But that's neither here nor there. We're not doing trades in this mock, so I'm kind of left with however the board fell to me. And at least for me, in terms of positional need and talent available, Charles Cross is the best guy I can go with. Right now, they're looking at Cam Erving as their starting left tackle, or possibly Brady Christensen, who I thought was a pretty decent tackle prospect last year. They seem to more insist that he's a guard because of whatever their length thresholds are. I'm not going to get into that debate, even though I do think that Christensen is more of a tackle than a guard, but hey, their coaches disagree, so I'm just going to draft with accordance of what their coaches want, which seems to be a tackle with longer arms. So Charles Cross definitely fits that bill. He's got great feet. He's got really good hand usage, very refined in terms of technique as a pass protector. As a run blocker, he's just okay. I don't really think he has the same power as Evan Neal or obviously as Ike Ekwonu. It's not even close. But he is at least functional as a run blocker, so I don't necessarily consider him a liability there. But in terms of just pass protection, if we want Sam Darnold to take less hits, I think Charles Cross is the easy guy to go with here. And just looking at the Panthers' offense as a whole, they're not really lacking in weapons. They do have DJ Moore. They do have Robbie Anderson. They took Terrace Marshall last year, who I loved. Rashard Higgins is the wide receiver 4. Shi Smith presumably is going to be the wide receiver 5/slot/gadget guy. They still have Christian McCaffrey, obviously, at running back. So there is still a lot of talent here in this Panthers offense. They just had such a shitty offensive line last year that they couldn't really make use of that talent. Say whatever you want about Sam Darnold. He obviously completely fell apart after the first 3 weeks of last season, but I do think that he would have at least looked maybe remotely competent if he wasn't under pressure all day, every day for 17 straight weeks. So again, in the absence of being able to go get another guy that can start right now, whether that's Baker Mayfield or, maybe you make a move for somebody else around the league that we haven't even discussed yet, since we can't get another quarterback right now that's going to start on day one, we might as well make Sam Darnold's life a little bit less miserable, and that means upgrading the protection. And I don't think that this would be my last move either. Like, I would still look at adding guard depth on day 2 and day 3 as well, so that we never run into this issue again. Because guess what? Even if they do trade for Baker Mayfield, or even if they do take, Kenny Pickett or whatever on day 2, maybe even on day 1, we'll see, they're still going to need better protection anyway. So you still have to invest in the trenches. And for me, that starts with Charles Cross. It's just a really, really easy pick to me. And that'll bring us back to the New York Giants, who once again are on the clock at 7th overall. And I am still sticking with the same theme that I did at the 5th overall pick, which is making Daniel Jones as successful as we possibly can in his make or break year. I know. I'm going to hear from a lot of Giants fans that are saying they don't need receiver because they took Kadarius Toney last year and they seemed committed to him, and they signed Kenny Golladay and they still have Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard's back for 2022. I get that, and I don't care. To me, Garrett Wilson is Keenan Allen 2.0. And if you would rather have any of those 4 receivers than even 85% of Keenan Allen, then I just don't know what to say. Like, he is really, really good. And even if Kenny Golladay has a resurgence, and even if Kadarius Toney has a big year too, and Darius Slayton's catching deep balls, even if all of that happens, guess what? That means Garrett Wilson is probably going to be isolated on every single third down, and he's going to win on every single third down. Again, my goal with this draft is to make Daniel Jones successful. And if that means that Garrett Wilson is my wide receiver 4, that's going to help him be successful. The entire franchise revolves around making that investment work. That means with good pass protection and an endless supply of weapons. I don't even care how much investment it takes. Daniel Jones has to work. And if he doesn't work this year, then whatever, everything's fucked and they'll have to take Bryce Young next year anyway. Who cares? Right now, though, we have to make Daniel Jones work. That is the priority. If you want to go after another edge rusher on day 2, fine, go for it. Or DB or linebacker or, any other piece you want to. That's cool. Use the day 2 picks for that. On day 1, we are improving weapons and we are improving protections, period. And if it doesn't work now, well, then it's just never going to work. So for Giants fans' sake, fingers crossed. I'll leave it at that. And with that being said, let's get to only a slightly more bleak situation down in Atlanta, where the Falcons have the 8th overall pick. Like I said earlier, I would have definitely considered Drake London at 4th overall with the Jets, so this is not a reach to me. And in fact, technically, it's a value. Ultimately, I do think that London will probably be a top 10 to 15 pick. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where, but he is talented enough to be taken at this point in the round. In terms of skill set, he is your classic, big frame, big body, jump ball receiver that can just absolutely dominate on routes outside the numbers. If you want to throw back shoulder fades to him all day long, he can do that. If you want to work him in the red zone, he can do that. If you want to put him in the big slot position and have him just completely annihilate smaller nickel corners over the middle, he can absolutely do that as well. And in fact, his skill set as a receiver is not that dissimilar to Kyle Pitts. So to me, if you kind of want to have them both in the same offense and just kind of moving around, sometimes playing outside, sometimes playing inside, Pitts can obviously line up in the Y as well. You can put either of them in the backfield. If you just want to have them both be these gigantic movable chess pieces that are going to be really hard to match up with, because let's be honest, how many defenses have 2 defensive backs that are, 6'1", 6'2", or even bigger than that can both contest these guys? Modern defenses might have 1 bigger DB that can handle that matchup, but very rarely do they have 2. In fact, the only one that I can think of off the top of my head is probably Miami, who has Eric Rowe as kind of their tight end eraser. And then they also have Byron Jones and Xavier Howard, who both have size and can match up with, say, Drake London. But man, it's a very rare thing to have multiple DBs that size that can handle these two guys at the same time. So I think for me, having Pitts and London together kind of amplifies both of them just because they have very tough to deal with skill sets. And ultimately, that's going to be a great thing for Marcus Mariota as well. I don't necessarily see Mariota as the long-term answer in Atlanta, but I do think that if you just give him weapons and, God willing, the offensive line stays healthy for once, but if you kind of surround him with a supporting cast, you can probably win some games with him. He'll have to stay healthy first, which he's never been able to do, but I actually think there might be something there. By no means do I project them to be like a top-end NFC team, but hey, they still might be tough to beat, especially if they kind of load up with weapons this year and just kind of lean in on Marcus Mariota and see what he's got. They could at least potentially be average, which, hell, there's a lot of Falcons fans that would accept average at this point because, man, on paper, the future looks a lot more bleak than average. So I kind of like Drake London here. I think he's a perfect talent match. I think he's absolutely worth the pick. I think he amplifies what they already have in Kyle Pitts, who's a tremendous player. I think it helps Marcus Mariota potentially be as successful as possible. And hey, I mean, even if Marcus doesn't work out and they're looking at quarterback next year in what's going to be a very good quarterback class, I would rather start building the supporting cast now so that that young quarterback can step in next year and hopefully be as successful as possible. So for a lot of different reasons, not just for 2022, but for 2023 and beyond, I think that Drake London is a fantastic pick here. That is 8 selections down. We still have 24 more to go. But before I get to the Seahawks at 9th overall, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for today that helped to make this show possible in the first place, Hawthorne. Hawthorne is a premium tailored men's grooming brand that is all about matching men to the ideal products for their own body chemistry and their own lifestyle. All you have to do is to take a quick quiz online at Hawthorne's website where they'll ask you a whole bunch of different questions about your type of hair, your type of skin, and of course any preferences you have for fragrance or even your favorite drink, and they'll come up with a personalized list of products that fits all of your needs. From there, you can browse that list and pick whichever products you want to try out and which ones you don't, and you can get basically anything you'll ever need, from face cleanser to body wash to deodorants and cologne. And personally, I'm a big fan of their lotions and colognes. They've never really steered me wrong, especially because it's really dry where I live, and my skin, it tends to be terrible, and I have kind of dry skin by default. So I really rely on their lotion, especially when the Santa Ana winds come by later in the year. It really is a lifesaver. So I highly recommend everything they offer. And if you want to try it out for yourself and see if you like it as much as I do, Hawthorne also takes all of the risk out of it because you can get free shipping on your order and on any returns. And if you don't like your products, they'll even retailer them for you based on your feedback, also free of cost. So if you find anything in the Hawthorne catalog that you like, you can use my promo code FILMROOM10 to get 10% off your first order. Again, that is promo code FILMROOM10 on anything at hawthorne.co. That is HAWTHORNE.co. They are really good products and their catalog is gigantic, so I'm sure there's at least something for everybody there. Thank you again to Hawthorne for sponsoring today's show. And with that, let's get back to the mock draft with the Seattle Seahawks at the 9th overall pick. This pick is relatively self-explanatory when you look at the Seahawks depth chart. Right now, their 2 starting tackles projected are Stone Forsythe and Jake Curhan. And even though I was a huge fan of Stone Forsythe last year, in fact, I had him as a first-round prospect, and I thought he was actually one of the most consistent pass protectors in last year's draft class, I do think that there is still a legit possibility they go tackle at 9 here, at least to address right tackle across from Forsythe. Worst case scenario, if I completely whiffed on Forsythe and he's not good, well, then Ikem Ekwonu projects to be a pretty good left tackle prospect in his own right, so having somebody who I think could play either right or left tackle, or even he could play guard for you, in the future if maybe he doesn't work out at tackle and you have to kick him inside, and you look at the contracts for Gabe Jackson, it's actually not that hard to get out of pretty soon here, so long-term, kind of looking at the positional flexibility of Ikem Ekwonu. If he doesn't work out at tackle, I do think he could work out at guard. At minimum, I think he's playing right tackle as a rookie and probably being pretty effective at that. He is a better run blocker at the moment than he is a pass blocker, but he's not a bad pass blocker at all. I do think he does have some issues in terms of getting over aggressive and kind of leaning over his toes a little bit. Jermaine Johnson, most notably, is the one who took advantage of that in the NC State-Florida State game. But overall, in terms of total body of work, you still saw really quick feet, you saw immense power, you saw the length. There are just a lot of tools there to work with as a pass protector, even though he is not refined. I know that there are plenty of other position groups that I could have looked at here, and there are some Seahawks fans that even kind of like the possibility of Desmond Ridder at 9th overall here. That's a little rich for my blood. I just kind of wanted to go with the best overall player available at a position that I at least deem to be a semi-need, and that is Ikem Ekwonu. Next up, we have the return of the Jets to this mock draft with their second pick inside the top 10. Yes, you read that correctly. Arnold Ebiketie is a top 10 pick in my mock draft. And I know there's a lot of Jets fans right now furiously typing on their computers saying, "What the fuck, Brett? Why did you not take Kayvon Thibodeaux? He was sitting right there." And believe me, I get it. There's a lot of people that think Thibodeaux is a top 2 edge in this class. There are some people that think he's a top 1 edge in this class. And I'm not going to completely disagree with why people like him so much, because there is a lot to like. In my unreleased defensive line rankings, I kind of have, again, a tier system of tier 1 edge rushers, and both Ebiketie and Thibodeaux are both in that tier 1. So I have very comparable grades for both of them. However, I do value Ebiketie just a little bit more. When you look at Ebiketie's combination of both production and athletic profile, he is one of the most bulletproof prospects in this entire class. He has exceptional length at over 34-inch arms, which is a big threshold for a lot of teams. His first step is fantastic, and that really shows up in his jumps, which were 38 inches in the vert and 10.8 in the broad, which is insane. But you also have to factor in that he had a sub-7 3-cone as well, which is also a huge threshold for teams. And his size profile is also a little bit hard to deal with for offensive tackles because he's about 6'2.5", but he's still really thick at 250. The last guy that I can remember that had a similar type of size profile where he was a little bit shorter, so he had a natural leverage advantage over every single tackle he faced, while also having really long arms, so those tackles couldn't outreach him, and having an explosive first step, and having a sub-7 3-cone that really showed up in how fluid they were in terms of bending and flattening around the corner. Believe it or not, it was Justin Houston. It is almost an exact match to Arnold Ebiketie to me. It is virtually the same profile. So kind of looking at this pick and where I value all these edge rushers, if you told me that I was getting a guy that had everything from, the hip fluidity to the first step to the length to the power to the production, if you had all of that in one prospect, why wouldn't I take that in the top 10? If I just looked at the profile of Ebiketie in a vacuum and the profile of Thibodeaux in a vacuum and did not know their names, I would pick Ebiketie. And that is not me talking down on Thibodeaux at all. He is still a fantastic player. He is still a first-round pick. It's a very similar argument of, Walker versus Hutchinson. Just because I prefer one doesn't mean I don't like the other. But, we're talking about a top 10 pick here, and I gotta go with the guy that I have graded higher. And at least for me, that is Arnold Ebiketie. I can almost guarantee you that in the real draft tomorrow, he is not going to go this high because I'm probably higher on him than, everybody else. But it wouldn't be my mock draft if I didn't stick to my guns and, have people who I believe to be top 10 picks as top 10 picks. So to me, he's one of the 10 best players in this class. And I kind of feel good about having him this high. Feel free to come back here in like 2 or 3 years if I completely whiff on this and get it wrong. But hey, it's my mock. I'm going to pick who I want. And with that, let's get to the 11th overall pick with the Washington Commanders. They are now on the clock, and I think we're going to go back to being a little bit chalky. The only real quote-unquote problem with Derek Stingley is durability. Everybody that I've talked to that either coached against him or played against him or even was around him in that LSU building and knew him personally, they have all talked about him like the next Darrelle Revis. And if you go back to the 2019 season when he was still a true freshman, he played like the next Darrelle Revis. Like, he was the best corner in the country as an 18-year-old. And he was playing in the best conference against the best receivers. If he came out after that true freshman season, hell, he probably would have been a top 5 pick that year. And that's saying a lot. Unfortunately, obviously, he dealt with injuries pretty much from like January of his freshman year until now. And I think he only played 2 games in 2021, if I recall correctly, before, unfortunately, he had to have Liz Frank surgery. So we just haven't really seen a whole lot from him over the last 2 years. It's been kind of out of sight, out of mind. Like, even when he was playing in 2020, he was still playing banged up. So we haven't really seen the actual Derek Stingley since 2019. And that's probably the only reason why he's even available at 11th overall in the first place, is because durability is a legitimate concern. If he does stay healthy, he's a Pro Bowl corner. And in fact, he might be even better than that. Like, if you told me he was an all-pro within 3 years, I would totally believe that too, because he is exceptionally talented. And in terms of work ethic and off-the-field stuff, he's about as clean and easy as it gets for an evaluation as well. I checked in personally with my buddy who was around Stingley at the LSU program, and I kind of wanted to get an idea of what he's like as a person, and the first 2 words he sent back were, he's a quiet killer. He shows up every single day, he works hard, he does his job, and his side of the field is just where receivers go to die. They just don't get anything done against him when he's healthy. So I think he is a slam dunk pick for pretty much any team in the top half of the first round. Like, if you just don't know who to take and Derek Stingley's on the board, take him, because he's going to be a good player, and at least you're not throwing away the pick. So in the end, I'm going with Derek Stingley here because I think the Commanders could just use a good player. You throw him in there and he probably starts as a rookie, and he'll probably be a franchise cornerstone for several years. And with that, let's get to the Vikings at the next pick at 12th overall, who are also going to be taking a corner for themselves. I think I can hear the sigh of relief from every single Vikings fan watching this, because they are all deathly afraid of both Sauce and Stingley being off the board. If you ask any Vikings fan what their worst case scenario is, it's one of the top 2 corners not being there at 12th overall, because by far, that is the biggest need that the Vikings need to address right now. We can talk about quarterback of the future, we could talk about receiver depth, we could talk about offensive line depth, but in terms of being a competitive football team in 2022, they cannot go into this year with only Patrick Peterson and Cam Dantzler and Shannon Sullivan as their top 3 corners. They just can't do it. They need another young cornerstone to build around where, even if he's not starting immediately over Dantzler or Peterson, which he should, like, he's talented enough that he should, but hey, worst case scenario, let's say, week 1 of September, he's the 4th corner. That's fine. I at least want to see some injection of youth and talent into this secondary, because holy shit, they need it really bad. Sauce Gardner probably would start week 1 because he's very polished, he's very physical, he's got traits out the wazoo. Like, he's pretty much everything you want from a starting boundary corner, and him not taking the field in week 1 would be a surprise to me, but at minimum, he needs to be on the roster, or one of these corners needs to be on the roster, because they can't go through life with this secondary again. I have watched too many Vikings games where they either blow leads or they get into shootouts that they can't maintain because the secondary has been an abject disaster for way too long. They have not been able to figure out the corner position for years and years and years. And believe me, they've tried, but they just haven't been able to get it right. And God willing, Sauce Gardner is going to be the pick that finally gets it right. So luckily in this mock, he was still available. I don't know what I would have done if he wasn't available. I'm just happy he was. And if you know a Vikings fan, or if you are a Vikings fan, keep your fingers crossed and pray to whatever football deity you pray to for one of these corners to be available at 12th overall tomorrow night, because if they're not, it's going to be bad. It's going to be rough in Minnesota, I can tell you that much. Now, it is time to bring the Texans back into this mock once again for their second pick of the first round at 13th overall. I'll be honest, George Pickens to Houston in the top 15 is the one pick where if I had to bet my mortgage on it not happening, this is what I would bet on not happening. He does not fit the vibe that Nick Caserio is trying to build at all, but he definitely fits my vibe, which is why I put him at 13th overall. He is a grimy, physical, just ultra nasty X receiver that loves to block. I think he loves just dominating defensive backs and kind of asserting his will. Some people are going to say he has, maturity issues. I get that, but to me, just kind of looking at the player, like I don't see any red flags off the field. I think that, maybe he's taken things a step too far sometimes on the field, but I don't necessarily, see this bad human being that some people are trying to make him out to be. He's just a very aggressive, passionate player that sometimes is going to get a couple extra flags that you don't really like. But man, as a player, he is phenomenal. My buddy Charles McDonald, who runs the excellent Exempt List podcast for Underdog Fantasy, he said it best, I think, when he said that every team needs a George Pickens, but they need exactly one George Pickens. He is a very unique prototype, but goddamn do I love watching him play football. He's kind of the missing piece, I think, to a lot of receiving cores. And even though I know that Nick Caserio is never going to draft him because he's not their choir boy prototype, if I was running a team and I needed a physical X receiver that could go in on the boundary, he could get deep, that could, take DB's lunch money in the run game and just kind of, enforce their will on the football field, man, I agree with Charles. You can only have one of these guys, but if I could only have one, I want it to be George Pickens. To be honest, if I have to make a prediction of where he's actually going to go, I mean, how could you not see him in a Ravens uniform just beating the shit out of Steelers DBs for the next 8 to 9 years? It's so perfect. He is so Baltimore. Like, I cannot get over how fucking Baltimore this dude is. It's unbelievable how good of a fit that would be. And I kind of hope it happens just for entertainment value because I'll get to watch him on Monday Night Football in the bank for like the rest of his career and buy a jersey and love every minute of it. I really hope that happens. But yeah, in this mock draft, he's unfortunately gone one pick before the Ravens. And, speaking of the Ravens, why don't we get to them at 14th overall? Because that's another pick where there are a lot of Ravens fans that might disagree with it, but I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised when you look back in 2 or 3 years and you see who I have picked out for him. Josh Paschal, to me, is another one of these guys who is a quintessential Raven. Like, if I had to just put a jersey on him in my mind, a Ravens jersey is what's going to pop up because he fits everything they love in a football player. He is extremely tough, he's really explosive, and most of all, he's versatile. If you want to play a 4 down front and put him as like a base end at 6 technique, he can do that. If you want to stand him up at outside linebacker, just have him be a really, really big outside linebacker, he can do that as well. If you want to kick him inside on 3rd downs and have him as a 3 technique, and then on the other side, you got Justin Madubuike as the other 3 technique, and you got Adafa Owa on the edge right next to him, maybe throw in Calais Campbell just because you can as that 4 down front on 3rd and long. I mean, God, he would be exceptional there too because he's just way too quick for most guards to handle. He is extremely versatile. He can play a variety of roles, and in a defense that, in my mind, tends to prioritize versatility above all else, especially with the return of Mike Macdonald to the staff, I just think he is a dream fit for this Ravens defense. And I don't necessarily think it's too early to take him either. I think that he is in the same tier 1 of edge rushers that I have Arnold Ebiketie and Kayvon Thibodeau and Trayvon Walker and Hutchinson. Like, I have a pretty substantially large tier 1. I think Paschal's right up there with all of them. He is kind of in a tweener body. He's about 6'2.5", 270, but he's got an extremely good first step, which is also reflected in that vertical of 38 inches with a 10.3 broad. His 1.62-10 split in the 40 is just insanely quick. And when you package that with his natural leverage and his strength, and he's got a little bit better hips than I think showed up in the testing as well. I do think he corners better than he's given credit for. He just overall is such a good profile for a pass rusher, and a pass rusher that can line up all over the place. So in the absence of my dream pick of George Pickens being available, I'm going to go with the next best thing and just take another guy that profiles perfectly to fit in with the Ravens culture and just kind of keep adding to that pass rush and adding to that defense, and we can go back and at least try to address receiver depth on day 2. And with that, let's get to the first of multiple Eagles picks in the first round here in this mock draft. First coming in with a pick that used to belong to the Miami Dolphins, which is now 15th overall. I know that there's a lot of Eagles fans out there jumping for joy, or maybe not, because a lot of them probably expected me to also go Kayvon Thibodeau here, but man, Jordan Davis being available at 15 is a fantastic scenario and a pretty lucky one for Eagles fans here. But Jordan Davis to me is one of the 5 best players in this class. He only dropped because of a combination of, lack of need for defensive tackle for a lot of teams above them, and also the fact that defensive tackle in general is seen as a quote-unquote lower value position. I don't necessarily fully agree with that, but I understand why some people see it that way. To me, I think it's kind of like wide receiver, where there's a lot of wide receivers out there, and some people would say they're a dime a dozen, but if you have one of the elite ones, Aaron Donald, Chris Jones, Fletcher Cox at one point, I think was in that category. You pay whatever money you need to keep them in the fold because they are virtually impossible to replace. To me, Jordan Davis has a good chance of ending up as that type of defensive tackle. And he's not just a nose tackle like some people are projecting. He can play 3 technique, he can play 4-eye, you want him to play 5 technique. He's a good enough athlete to play pretty much everything but edge rusher. And if you look how Georgia used him, they put him at 3 technique a lot, and they would put either Carter or Wyatt as a 2-eye on the backside, or even sometimes as a 1 on the backside. And they would put, big ass Jordan Davis at 370 or 360. He kind of slimmed down for the combine, but in terms of playing weight, he was playing at 350, and they put him at 3 technique just because they could. And when you have that kind of size and power at 3 technique, you pretty much can't run a significant portion of your playbook because there's no guard on planet Earth that is going to be able to dig him out and move him off the line of scrimmage. So now you have to call stuff that demands double teams, or you're praying to God that your tackle can do a down block if you want to run, some sort of pin and pull to the outside. But even then, good luck. Especially if there's a big hulking defensive end as a 6 technique that's right next to Jordan Davis. It just completely eliminates, from a schematic perspective, a significant portion of the playbook when you have somebody that big that can also penetrate with that good of a first step. It is an entirely unique problem for offenses to have to deal with, and it was a big contributing factor of why that Georgia defense was so good, because Jordan Davis completely changes the math. It's not just about him playing 2-eye or nose or 3. It's the fact that you can put him at all of those spots, stem the front pre-snap, and kind of change where he's lining up. And then all of a sudden the math changes again. The angles change again. You might not have a run play dialed up that you can run into that front with him, kind of stemming into his new position, and you're just fucked. So it's a completely different problem that most NFL defenses, let alone college defenses, most NFL defenses cannot present that kind of problem with how they kind of line up in the front 4. So I would take Jordan Davis here at 15 and kind of laugh my way to the bank because he is such a unique player and somebody that you can't really replicate with anybody else. He's not a nose tackle. He's an everything. And to me, if you have somebody that big and that fast who can play any spot on the defensive line other than edge rusher, then he is literally one of the most valuable players in this entire draft class at any position. I don't care what little letters are right next to his name. Throw that out. He is not that easy to categorize, and he is kind of a one of one to me. So yeah, Jordan Davis, 15th overall, sign me up. I don't care what the rest of the depth chart looks like. Just sign me up. He is worth the pick. And that brings us to the Saints, who are making their first but not final appearance in this mock draft. They have multiple picks in the first round, the first of which, of course, being at 16th overall. As I've mentioned many times before, and I'm going to reiterate here, I do not expect the Saints to actually pick at 16 here. I think they're all in on trading up inside the top 10 for one of these top 3 tackles, because left tackle is easily the biggest need on the roster, and it's not even close. But in the absence of being able to do a trade in this mock, and seeing how, in my opinion, few needs they actually have on the team, I'm a little bit more comfortable kind of reaching here for, the next best tackle I can get. And even though Bernhard Raimann isn't the 16th best player in the class, I don't really think it's even close. I do think that the drop-off after, Bernhard Raimann, Zach Tom, that kind of little mini cluster after the top tier, I think the drop-off is enough to make me just want to address left tackle right now and bet on Doug Marrone to develop Raimann into what I think he can be eventually. A lot of the B-roll that you're looking at right now is him getting absolutely smoked at the Senior Bowl, which he did, and I'm not entirely sure why he changed his technique so much from when he was at Central Michigan to when he showed up in Mobile. Like, his sets were completely different, how he used his hands was different. He kind of just made himself a mess whenever he was training for Senior Bowl. I'm not really sure why he did that. I would much prefer he goes back to, what he was doing at Central Michigan and what I think Doug Marrone is going to emphasize teaching, which is angle sets, independent hand usage, letting rushers come to him and kind of using his size and strength to his advantage. I think when he was trying all this jump set stuff at the Senior Bowl, he's not prepared to play in that style. So I kind of want him to go back to the more conservative pass pro that he was doing in college, and I think that that's where he's best as well. So I'm kind of trusting the athletic talent here and what we know that he is as an athlete, which he is a freak, and I'm trusting Doug Marrone to, for lack of a better word, fix him, because I think that he can be fixed. It's not like he's, completely incapable of playing as a rookie. They just might have to do a little bit of work to get him there. So I'm kind of gambling a little bit, but I'm going to trust the upside. I'm going to trust the coaching staff. And I think that they can possibly turn this into being another franchise left tackle. Let's move on now to the Chargers at 17th overall, where even though they have made a lot of progress addressing their needs, I kind of want to double down here and go all in. From what I can tell, it seems like the Chargers really want to lean into, doing a lot of odd fronts, doing a lot of, well, maybe not a lot, but at least kind of mixing in more tight front stuff, all of that kind of spill and kill mentality, the anti-spread stuff that you see at the collegiate level. I think they want to do a lot more of that if they have the defensive line to pull it off, which they did not have it last year. But I do think that in 2022, they want to be able to have the defensive line that's capable of it. Right now, we're looking at a rotation of Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, Christian Covington's still there. You got Braden Fajoko. On the edges, obviously, you have Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack, so they're totally fine there. They also have Jerry Tillery, but I think the less he plays, the better at this point. Either way, even though they have made investments along the interior of that defensive line in order to play this style that I think Brandon Staley wants to play, I want to add one more piece, not just for injury proofing, but also just to kind of elevate the talent once more so that I really feel comfortable with them playing all these odd fronts. So I'm looking at Devonte Wyatt here, who could play 5 technique. He's played 4-eye. You could play 3. If you want to put him at 2-eye, I mean, you probably couldn't do nose, but maybe if you want to get away with it for a couple snaps, you could. He just has a lot of different flexibility, and Georgia used him all over the place. Again, they put him anywhere from a 2-eye to, out wide to a 5, and he played all of those roles exceptionally well. I think Devonte Wyatt is a natural fit for the system that I think Staley wants to run because it's not that far off from what Kirby Smart ran at Georgia. I think he's a very talented player, arguably the best penetrating 3 technique in this class if we're just talking about traditional defensive tackle roles. But he also comes with all of the flexibility that if you want to get into more of the 3-4 realm, he can do all that stuff too. I think he's one of the very best players in this class. I don't necessarily worry about his age. I know some people are concerned about that, but interior defensive line is a position group that tends to age rather gracefully. So I still think you're going to get multiple contracts out of him at a minimum. I don't know. Overall, I just look at the talent. I look at the scheme fit. I look at the fact that a 24-year-old entering the league at this position isn't that big of a deal. I think it's a perfect fit at 17. Is it the most dire need on the roster right now? Probably not anymore, but I do kind of want to turn a weakness into a strength and just never have to worry about this run defense ever again. If I can go into this year and not have to worry about the Broncos or about the Raiders, running 150 yards plus every single time that they play against each other, I feel a lot more better about the Chargers' chances with that in mind. So Devonta Wyatt, perfect fit in a variety of ways, and if he went off the board at 17, I would love that for the Chargers. Next up, we have the return of the Eagles once more to the first round with their second first-round pick at 18th overall. All right, it's finally time for Kayvon Thibodeaux to come off the board, and I think that at this point in the draft, somewhere around the middle of the first round is where he starts to become a value. I do not think that he is the best edge prospect in this class. I know a lot of people would disagree with that, but I don't necessarily think that he's a poor prospect either. I think he's very solid. I think he's got a wicked long arm move, a really good first step. I do want to see more variety in terms of how he rushes the passer. Sometimes I think he's a little bit too one-dimensional as a rusher, and he kind of relies on that speed to power. He'll do a ghost move every now and then, but not as much. And even then, he's still a little bit tight in the hips, so it's not as good of a ghost move where, you kind of dip the shoulder and then crank the hips around like what you see TJ Watt do, Von Miller, to a degree, Myles Garrett, even though he's so damn big, it's hard for him to, fully dip all the way down sometimes. But so it's an okay ghost move as a counter to his long arm, but I still want to see more of an inside counter. I also think that he could stand to improve his swipe move, which he doesn't throw that often, but maybe it's because, again, the hips are a little bit stiff, so he's not the best at cranking them around as he tries to flatten the corner. And I know all of this sounds super negative. It's not. I'm just doing minor criticism here to explain why I have him at 18th overall and not at 3rd overall. He's a really good player. He's a really good pass rusher. And kind of pairing him up together with Jordan Davis, I think is a great way to kind of reestablish the pipeline of defensive line talent in Philly, which of course they've been known for a really long time. As for all of the quote-unquote personality questions with Thibodeaux, I've never interviewed the guy. I've never talked to him. Personally, I don't know anything about that. Maybe he'll slip in the draft because of whatever those questions are, but I'm not going to speculate too much on it. If he does fall, I think it's going to be more related to what he is as a player rather than who he is as a person. Because we've seen some not great human beings still be top 5 picks if they're talented enough. So I don't really think that's the issue here. I just think that people are kind of comparing him to some of the other edge prospects and saying, okay, he's good, but he's not, Myles Garrett. He's not Chase Young. He's not even Khalil Mack when Khalil was coming out. So it's just kind of a different level of prospect here. Very solid player, but maybe not the world beater that some of us thought he might be when we were watching him as a true freshman. So hopefully that kind of explains my thought process a little bit and why I have him dropping to where I do. And with that, let's get to one more pick for the Saints where they come back into the first round all the way at 19th overall.
Like, ride with me if you ride with me, you can slide with me if you feel like 550 on the 5 sticky, come get high with me, that's a deal, right? Ride with me if you ride with me, you can slide.
Okay, looking at the Saints' second first rounder here, we did get our left tackle of the future, hopefully, at 16, and I think we really only have one more major need on the roster that needs to be addressed right now. And once again, I'm going to be swinging for the fences here and kind of trusting my coaching staff to get the most out of a very talented player in Christian Watson from North Dakota State. And this is probably going to be the highest that you see Watson go in anybody's mock draft, but I am a big believer in his talent. I think he's a really good route runner, or rather an underrated route runner because he wasn't asked to do a whole lot at North Dakota State. But when he showed up in Mobile, he had a really fun release package. He was beating people off the line in press every single day, never lost a rep, ran every single route you can imagine. So I just think that he didn't get to showcase what he was as a route runner. And I think that obviously the size and the speed and the fluidity and the yards after catch ability, they gave him sweeps just to get him involved in the run game. He is the complete package athletically on top of being a better route runner than he's given credit for. The one problem you can point to is, kind of inconsistent hands here and there, which I think is more of a concentration drop issue than just him having bad hands. but you also have to factor in that his drop rate, which was pretty significant, was kind of inflated just because they didn't throw the ball that much at North Dakota State, so every single drop counted for a lot. I think it was 13.7% of a drop rate, if I remember correctly, so the sample size was a little bit small, so the drop rate looked bigger in terms of total numbers of drops than it actually was. I don't necessarily think it's that big of an issue that people are kind of making it out to be. He dropped some balls, but he's not bad in terms of catching the football. That's two very different things. Overall, just when looking at the physical gifts, looking at the route running acumen, I think looking at the fact that he has a lot of untapped potential that didn't show up in the box score in college, very similar to DK Metcalf, where he had a lot of production concerns coming out of Ole Miss. I think he profiles as somebody who's going to be a lot better pro than he was in college. So I do think that in the real draft, he's probably going to go higher than people think, because I think a lot of scouts and GMs might agree with that assessment, especially if they saw him live at the Senior Bowl. So just kind of keep an eye on this. I do ultimately think he will be a first-round pick. Maybe not this high in the first round, but I do think he will get there, because having 5 years of contract control over somebody this talented, especially considering what the wide receiver market is right now, there's a financial element to this too. So being able to have this guy on your team for a long time at a relatively cheap cost with this high of a ceiling, that to me makes him worth 19th overall. And from there, why don't we get to 20th overall with the first appearance of the Steelers on the clock. There are a lot of different ways that I could have gone with this pick. I look at wide receiver, they're a little bit thin there. I think they could use more defensive line help. I think that even safety would be a consideration here, and there's a lot of different names that I could have turned to, and all of them would have made sense. Jalen Petrie, Dax Hill, I mean, pretty much any Georgia player ever would have fit here. But ultimately, I decided to go with Andrew Booth Jr. because I still think that corner is an area where I wanted to invest a premium pick to make sure that above all else, that position group was secured. Right now, we're looking at a starting trio of Levi Wallace, Cam Sutton, and Ahkello Witherspoon, which is certainly not the worst in the league, but I do want a true number one corner in that group, and I think that Andrew Booth has the potential to be that kind of corner. He's an exceptional athlete, kind of in that prototypical big, long press/press bail prototype. He's not necessarily somebody that I want to play a lot of off coverage with. I don't think he quite has the feet or the hip fluidity for that. But if I'm just lining him up in press and saying to go beat up somebody and just kind of force them out down the boundary, if I want him to kind of bail out and play zone, he has a ton of range, he has great ball skills, and also he's a phenomenal tackler as well when he's kind of coming downhill. Like, he's not a corner that's afraid of hitting people. In fact, he actually relishes in it. So I think that he'd be an asset against the screen game as well, because he has no qualms turning himself into a human missile. Just kind of looking at the defense that the Steelers tend to like to run with Minkah Fitzpatrick as like a true deep middle post safety. They like to lean a lot into these cover 3 looks and cover 1 looks. I think that Booth specifically fits that style of defense really well. And if you combine him with Minkah on the back end, I mean, those are probably 2 of the rangiest athletes that you can find if you want to run like a traditional cover 3. Obviously, this pick can go in a wide variety of different directions, and I think that they're one of the most fascinating teams to mock for because you can kind of throw any name in there and make it make sense. But for me specifically, again, just looking at what they need on the roster and looking at kind of the shelf after that first top tier of corners and what's going to be left over on day 2, I would rather address corner now and then look at defensive line or wide receiver on day 2 where there's a little bit more depth. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense for all you Steelers fans watching this. And with that, let's get to pick number 21, where we finally get the Patriots on the clock. This is likely one of the most no-brainer picks in this entire mock draft, just kind of looking at the combination of talent and fit and, of course, draft value here. Putting Zion Johnson with the Patriots almost just seems too easy. He would slide in right at that right guard spot, replacing presumptive starter right now, James Ferentz, which would give the Patriots a starting 5 of Isaiah Wynn, Michael Onwenu, David Andrews, Zion Johnson, and Trent Brown, which, to me, I love that. that would probably be a really good offensive line, not just for the AFC, but in the NFL in general. That would be, in my opinion, one of the best and most talented offensive lines in the entire league. And this pick fits right in line with what I always try to do when I'm mocking for a team with a young quarterback, which is to do everything possible to make them successful. Whether it's improving protection or improving weapons or both, just whichever the best offensive asset that I can find to help my young quarterback, that's what I'm going to take. And for me, that's going to be Zion Johnson here. I think he's a phenomenally gifted player. He can play pretty much any spot on the interior. So if you want Onwenu to be right guard instead of right tackle, that's fine. You can put Zion Johnson at left guard and be totally cool there. If, maybe eventually David Andrews moves on and you want him to play center, he can do that as well. Either way, he's going to be a Patriot for a really long time with positional flexibility. He also fits the culture really well. He's a great locker room guy. One of the smartest players in this class too, by the way. Like, he is an absolute joy to talk to. I think he's a phenomenal pick here. And if he is on the board, which is a big if, and the Patriots pass on him, I would be stunned. Like, there would need to be some other crazy value on the board to make me think that Zion Johnson is not going to be a Patriot, because man, it's a perfect fit. It really, really is. So this is one of those picks that I fully expect to actually happen on draft day, tomorrow or today, whenever this video gets released. I think it's a slam dunk. Why don't we now get to the Packers at 22nd overall with their first of multiple picks in this mock. Unlike, apparently, the actual Packers front office, I'm going to do everything that I can to not piss off Aaron Rodgers, and I'm going to give him one of the best receivers in this class in Chris Olave. And even though this is a little bit early for my own overall prospect rankings, I recognize the need on the roster is so ridiculously great right now that I cannot pass on wide receiver. Like, I have to take one right now. Because if I let the Chiefs, potentially take another one, and, maybe the Titans will take one depending on what they think is going to happen with A.J. Brown, the Lions could take one. I have to take receiver right here, right now, because I don't know what's going to be available on day 2. So I'm willing to reach a little bit and get Chris Olave, who also is a great player in his own right. I think he's more of a Z than a true X. You could probably put him in the slot depending on how much you want to block with him. And by that, I mean he should not block at all. So some teams will exclusively see him as a Z because he doesn't really have any blocking ability. But I think for the Packers, their entire wide receiving core is wide open. Like, I don't think that there's any true positions locked down right now other than maybe Lazard at X because he's a good blocker. But man, the position group overall is so bereft of talent. I'll take whatever I can get. And that's going to be Chris Olave. He's going to be my starting Z from day one. Really good route runner, excellent speed, really reliable hands. I just think that kind of using him as that movable chess piece at Z where he's in motion constantly and corners are never going to be quite comfortable matching up with him because of that motion. I think he's just too silky smooth for corners to handle in that kind of usage. And specifically on third downs, he is going to be a nightmare to cover. So just having a receiver on the roster that I think can keep the chains moving and keep Aaron Rodgers on the field, in general, that's going to help the Packers win more games. So if Chris Olave is there, I would be doing a massive disservice to Packer Nation if I didn't take him, especially with how the draft has already played out and how many wide receivers have already gone. It's a no-brainer pick and one that I ultimately have to make. So that pick is ultimately pretty easy, all things considered. Why don't we get to a pick that's actually a little bit harder to project with the Arizona Cardinals finally coming on the board at 23rd overall.
Pick it up, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. You see the drippy, I'm fitted up. Hop in my car and the giddy up. Secure the bag, yeah, I get the bus. Pick it up, pick it up, pick it up.
The Cardinals are another one of these teams that I think could go in a lot of different directions, but just kind of looking at their depth chart and matching it up with available top-tier talent, I ended up going with Boye Mafe from Minnesota. This is a team that I think could really use a replenishment of edge rushing talent, even though they do have some pieces that I like with Marcus Golden, and weirdly Dennis Gardeck is also somehow an effective pass rusher despite his physical limitations. Like, he's actually been pretty productive in the past, but I still think that they need at least one more guy to go with Golden and Gardeck and Kennard, and somebody who I think has the ability, or at least the ceiling, of a top-tier pass rusher like what they used to have with Chandler Jones. Mafe does have a little bit of one-year wonder syndrome, so I understand why some people are kind of turned off by that, or at least a little bit concerned by that. But looking at his athletic profile and just looking at the tape and how that athleticism really pops off the screen, I mean, you see everything you want in a franchise pass rusher. You see the burst, you see the bend, you see the power. He's got a bigger frame than a lot of the other guys in this class at well over 250 pounds. There's just a lot to like here, and I think his ceiling is insanely high. I think specifically he's a good match with the Cardinals because I think he can learn a lot from J.J. Watt there, who's now kind of in that elder statesman mentor type role. But J.J.'s always been one of the best technicians and one of the most instinctual pass rushers in the entire league. And so I think that him doing the same thing for Mafe that Antonio Smith did for J.J. when J.J. was still young and in Houston and he was learning from Antonio Smith, I think kind of passing on that knowledge and passing on that technical refinement to Boye Mafe could turn him into legitimately one of the scariest pass rushers in the NFC. It might take a year, it might take 2 years, but he certainly has the ability to get there, and I think it is a worthy gamble somewhere in the back half of the first round. I'm not entirely sure how high he's going to go in the actual draft, but I would be willing to bet it's somewhere in the top 32 picks because athletes like him don't grow on trees, and if he goes to the right spot, he could be really, really special. Now, why don't we keep it with the edge rusher theme since this is such a phenomenal edge class, and we'll see who the Cowboys are likely going to try to replace Randy Gregory with when they're finally on the clock at 24th overall. Full disclosure, I'm not entirely sure that Jermaine Johnson is even going to get close to the 24th pick in the actual draft. And there's legitimate buzz that he could go as high as 4th to the Jets, which isn't as insane as you think it is. Like, he had a really good week at the Senior Bowl. He absolutely made an impression on everybody that was around him that week, so it's not that crazy to think he could be a top 5 to 10 pick. But in this mock, just from circumstances and how the board fell, he's here at 24, and so I can't pass up on him here. I think he fits a need. This is a team that obviously is trying to improve its pass rush, or rather replenish its pass rush after losing Randy Gregory, and I think that they just need that one extra piece to go with Micah Parsons and to go with Tank Lawrence so that it's not all on those two guys to get all of their pressures and all of their sacks on third downs. They have their Batman, and obviously they have their Robin, but I still think they need an Alfred, and Jermaine Johnson is going to be one hell of an Alfred for them. He's got pretty much every tool you can ask for: size, length, power, hip fluidity. I think he's got a really nifty spin move that he just abused a lot of tackles on this year. Sometimes I think he can be a little bit over-reliant on that spin move, but I do think that he at least has the tools to be a more, let's just say, diverse pass rusher. So he could get there eventually. But just kind of looking at the tools, looking at the production, looking at everything that he flashed in that one magical Senior Bowl week where everybody finally saw what he could do as a pass rusher, I think he's going to go somewhere in the top 25. I'd be very surprised if he doesn't. And if he is on the board for the Cowboys, just knowing what they need on that roster because of what they lost in free agency, if he's there and they don't take him, I would be stunned, like just flat out stunned. I think he's a great fit and well worth this pick here at 24. Coming up at 25th overall now, we have the first appearance of the Bills in this mock draft, and I do have them making a little bit of a curveball pick, but if you stick with me, I think I can explain it and get you on my side for why it makes a lot of sense. This is probably going to be the only mock draft you see anywhere where Jalen Petrie is going in the first round, let alone going in the first round to the Bills. But I do personally see this as a perfect fit in terms of talent, culture, position need, and just kind of future-proofing the roster based on their current contract situations. Jordan Poyer, who's been an excellent starting safety in Buffalo for a while now, He's looking for a new deal because right now it's pretty much 2022 and then nothing. He's going to get cut loose. And so he wants something more long-term. And in an ideal world, the Bills would give it to him because they love Jordan Poyer too. But you have to look at Josh Allen's cap hit and realize that some of these bills are going to be coming due pretty soon here. His cap hit in 2022 at quarterback is $16.4 million, and it's going up to just shy of $40 million next year. So they have to find a way to kind of trim the roster a little bit in terms of financial commitment, and I think they're going to be doing that at safety. Not that Poyer is some infinitely replaceable player because he's really good, but in terms of finding other DBs in this class that play in a similar style and I think have a similar presence to Poyer in a lot of different ways, this class is loaded with that type of dude. Whether you look at Daxton Hill, Lewis Seen, Jalen Petrie, the list goes on and on. There's a lot of safeties in this class that play like Jordan Poyer, and I think that Petrie is one of them. He was predominantly lined up in, whether you want to call it nickel, star, slot, whatever word you want to use, in Dave Aranda's nickel defense. He was in that general apex position for pretty much every single snap he played at Baylor last year. But he also has experience playing as a deep half safety. You know, he's a great blitzer off the edge. He plays the run with just incredible ferociousness. He really is more than just a nickel DB. He can do a lot of different things for you. And remember that Jordan Poyer, when he was coming out, he also was a corner in college that then converted to safety later. And, you know, Micah Hyde was a nickel that converted to safety. So it's not completely unreasonable that this guy who played mostly the nickel/star position in college can then transition to being more of a true safety in the NFL. And one more aspect to this that I really want to bring to light is leadership and locker room fit, because Buffalo is really big on locker room culture. They always like to bring in guys that work exceptionally hard, that are going to bring a strong locker room presence. And Petrie, at least from what was communicated to me, is one of the best leaders in this entire draft class at any position. When I was kind of doing my checkups with people that were around Petrie at Baylor, and one of them also happened to be around Jamal Adams at LSU, I asked him about how Petrie was off the field, and he said that even more than Jamal Adams, who was a legendary leader at LSU, he said that Petrie was the best leader he had ever seen. So I think that just based on what I've heard about him and how he interviews, this is going to be a guy who could be a captain within his first year in the NFL. He's a phenomenal player, extremely hard worker, great talent, versatile skill set. He is one of the 32 best players in this class, in my opinion. I know that he likely will not go in the first round, but neither did Javon Holland, and Javon Holland ended up being a fantastic rookie that I thought was also one of the 32 best players in his class last year. So it would not surprise me if Petrie ends up being one of these second-round safeties that we get every single year that ends up being, you know, borderline elite at his position. I think he is that good. So sign me up for Petrie in the first round. I know it's quote-unquote early for a lot of people, but not for me. I do think he is that good. Now, we are 75% of the way through this mock draft, and we've only had one quarterback go off the board, which is rather unusual, even in a quarterback class like this one. I think it's about time we remedy that and have QB2 finally come off the board with the Titans at 26. I know there's a lot of Titans fans that might be a little bit confused about going quarterback here because they feel like they are knocking on the door of being contenders once again. But I do want to remind people that we're not just building for 2022 here, we're building for 2023 and beyond. And the Titans cap situation after this coming season is a little bit messy. They have the 8th least projected cap space, obviously before restructures going into 2023. And Ryan Tannehill's contract, just kind of looking at how it's structured, there are 2 void years on the back end, which kind of complicate things a little bit. But the long and short of it is they do save about $18 million if they get out of that contract going into 2023. I think that they might need that cap space if they do ultimately want to retain A.J. Brown, because the wide receiver market is absolutely insane right now. And to be quite honest, I don't think there's a whole lot that Ryan Tannehill brings to the table at his age that Desmond Ridder couldn't also do. And this is not a shot at Ryan Tannehill. I think he is a fine quarterback. I think he was exactly what the doctor ordered when they brought him in, and he kind of elevated the team as a veteran leader who brought some athletic ability. He was a good deep ball thrower. He executed Arthur Smith's system extremely well. He did everything that they asked him to do, and he was a good quarterback for them. But I just think that looking at the tools that Desmond Ridder has, also with the mobility and the arm strength and the leadership, he can do a lot of what Ryan Tannehill does, but at a fraction of the cost. By no means do I ever expect Desmond Ridder to be on par with, say, Josh Allen or Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, any of these crazy talented AFC quarterbacks. I don't necessarily expect him to reach that high of a high. But if we're just looking at building a strong foundation of a roster that is cap manageable, and then putting a young, cheap quarterback in there that can execute the system and just drive the bus, why not have it be Desmond Ridder? After all, a lot of teams around the league have had success over the last 10 years by building extremely talented and deep rosters around cheap, malleable quarterbacks. I think that's the approach that Tennessee could opt to take here if they want to zig while the rest of the league is zagging. I mean, let's be real. They are way too good of a team to land Bryce Young next year, or even if you like Stroud or Levis or whoever your favorite quarterback is for 2023. They're not going to be bad enough to get any of those guys. They're going to have to build the roster a different way unless they just outright tank, which I don't think they want to do, because why would you? You're knocking on the door of the AFC Championship. You might as well build a contender. So the only way that they can do that is to get cheap at quarterback and then use all of their picks to try to find value elsewhere and fill holes on the roster and then just try to go win. So for me, just kind of looking at the contract situation and where the roster is right now, I don't think that they should tank. I don't think that they should give up. I just think that they should plan for life after Tannehill and just continue to build assets around what I think Desmond Ridder can bring to them in the future. Maybe a lot of Titans fans would disagree with that approach, but at least to me, that is going to be the best or perhaps the only way to sustain as strong of a roster they have for more than the next 2 or 3 years. But hey, if you're a Titans fan and you feel like I'm completely wrong here, feel free to chime in below and tell me who you would take, because I know that this pick is probably going to end up being one of the more controversial in this mock. But with that all being said, why don't we go now to the Buccaneers, who are fresh off of Tom Brady's unretirement, as predictable as that was, and they are finally on the clock now at 27th overall. The Bucs did unfortunately sustain some losses to their roster as they were trying to pay people and kind of keep their core together, though they did make up for it a little bit when they brought in Shaq Mason via trade. However, in my opinion, they could still use even more work on the offensive line to try to rebuild that front five. They currently have Aaron Stinney projected to be their starting left guard, and to me, with Kenyon Green still on the board and clearly a need for at least competition at that left guard spot, I can't really imagine a scenario where the Bucs pass on him here. He is a perfect fit for what they like to surround Tom Brady with in terms of play style. Just a big, physical, hulking pass protector that is never going to go backwards, because quite frankly, they always want to have room for Tom to step up rather than trying to leave the pocket. Obviously, Brady is not somebody who can make plays in space, so just kind of minimizing interior pressure, always having that front of the pocket clean and stable, that is the utmost priority here, and it's always what made Brady the most comfortable. They definitely don't need Green to play tackle, and to me, even though he did play right and left tackle as well as guard in college, I think he was really best at guard. They don't need him to ever take reps outside because they still have Donovan Smith and they have Tristan Wirfs, who's an all-pro caliber guy. So they can just leave him on the interior and just let him go do what he does well, which is completely cave in the point of attack and be rock solid in pass protection. Assuming Green does play guard in the NFL, if I had to guess which offensive lineman was immediately going to be grading out as one of the best players at his position as a rookie, Green would be one of the names that I have on my short list because he doesn't really have any issues on tape. Just like Zion Johnson with New England, this is a pick that is just too perfect to not make. And if he's still available while the Buccaneers are on the clock, I guarantee you every single Bucs fan in existence is going to be screaming for Kenyon Green. So this one's pretty easy for me. I'm going to keep it short and sweet as a result because there's not really much else to say. Why don't we go now to the Packers at 28th overall, making their return to this mock draft and potentially going in a little bit of a different direction than you expect. Once upon a time in the 2019 mock draft special, I mocked Rashawn Gary to the Packers, and a lot of Packers fans said I was insane. And I said, nope, they're going to want another edge rusher. They're going to want a third guy that they can develop, especially one that fits the system. And they took Rashawn Gary, and he ended up being, honestly, an even better player than I thought he was going to be. And I was very high on Gary coming out of school. And I think that we're in a similar position now with Gary going into the last year of his contract. Keep in mind the Packers do have a pretty decent amount of cap space going into next year, and that's before restructures. But they do have a lot of guys they have to pay. After 2022, obviously, Gary might need an extension. Jair Alexander is due for an extension. Elton Jenkins. Both of their starting safeties, Amos and Savage, are also going to be due for extensions. There's just a lot of guys on the roster that need money. And quite frankly, I don't know who they're going to want to prioritize, let alone how valuable all these contracts are going to be. I just personally, for me, in terms of how I would build a team, I see this issue coming a mile away. I kind of want to prioritize Elton Jenkins and Jair Alexander. And since I have Karlaftis sitting on the board here who can play a similar role either to Gary or Preston Smith or really any of these big edge rushers that they tend to prioritize, if I see a guy who can come in and hopefully, in an ideal world, do what Rashawn Gary does, but for a lot less money, that means that I can use all of my available cap space on all of the DBs that I don't think I can replace right now. Maybe if you only want to pay one of the safeties, that's fine, but you definitely have to pay Jair, and he's going to be commanding a lot of money, and you have to pay Elton Jenkins, who's going to be one of the top paid offensive linemen. There's just a lot of mouths to feed, and I think my way out of creating a massive issue with this roster is just drafting a year ahead, taking an edge rusher that can play that role, and then just kind of letting Rashawn Gary ride off into the sunset, get my third round comp pick, and then use that asset later. In an ideal scenario, yeah, we double dip at receiver, we give Aaron Rodgers even more weapons, but again, I'm not just approaching this mock draft for 2022, I'm approaching it for 2023 as well, and we already addressed receiver, so I kind of want to future-proof the roster with this pick. It's almost the exact same reason why I took Gary in this mock draft special in the first place a few years ago, and ironically, it's coming full circle once again. So, Packers fans, feel free to disagree with me. I totally understand if you do, but just based on how I would build the roster, this is how I would approach this problem. Let's move on now to the Chiefs at 29 with the first of back-to-back picks that they have in the first round. If there's one thing that I know about Steve Spagnuolo, it's that he loves DBs that can play a variety of roles. One of his favorite players that he's ever worked with was Tyrann Mathieu, because not only could he play deep safety, but he could play in the box, you could put him in the slot. He was excellent in terms of kind of patrolling over the middle in all of these robber looks that they love to call, and all these, crazy coverages with all the insane rotations. He loved using Tyrann in that way, and they don't really have anybody on the roster, in my opinion, that can fill that role. Justin Reed and Juan Thornhill are fantastic players, don't get me wrong, I love both of them, but in terms of having that third safety that can be a slot corner on some plays, he can be a blitzer, he can be kind of a patroller in the middle of the field, somebody who you can rotate deep and feel good about it, and maybe in a pinch, if you sustain injuries at corner, can go play corner on the outside. There's just not a whole lot of guys in this class that I think fit that description, and so I want to jump on one that's actually available here with Trent McDuffie from Washington, who I think is one of the more underrated players in this entire class. If we're just talking about straight outside cornerback skills, he's still a first-round pick, and I think he's a good corner prospect, but man, projecting him to safety, I think he's a destroyer of worlds. Like, I would not be shocked if he goes even higher than this, just because of how exciting he would be at safety. He is an incredibly explosive athlete, he's instinctual, he hits like a fucking Mack truck. Just imagine Kareem Jackson, who's also played nickel and safety throughout his career, but put a jetpack on him, and that's Trent McDuffie. For a defense that has always thrived under Spags by having three safeties on the field and kind of playing a shell game and moving people around, I can't imagine a better fit for what Spags likes to do, and specifically in this defense, I think McDuffie is a star waiting to happen. He might not be the pick that most Chiefs fans expect, but ultimately I do think it's the correct pick, and if we are lucky enough to have him go to Kansas City in the real draft, For me, as a football fan in general, that would be one of the most exciting picks of the draft because I would get to see him maximized to his fullest potential. And again, just kind of speaking as a general fan of the sport, I love to see ultra talented dudes get maximized in the right destination because that's how amazing careers happen. So hopefully we get to see something along those lines for Trent McDuffie. And I think kind of the same thing about who I have them taking at number 30 as well. Somebody who maybe wouldn't go this high for every team, but if he goes to Kansas City, I think he could immediately be a star. There has been so much buzz building about Sky Moore going in the first round, and I refuse to believe that there is no fire behind that smoke. He has almost everything you could want in a receiver prospect other than size, and I know that he is smaller than most guys, but he also has a thicker build, so I think he holds up against contact on the outside. I have no worries about him playing X and facing press coverage every single play, but I also think that he could be a really fun inside threat in the slot, or if you want to put him at Z and kind of have him be a gadget guy and, get carries in the run game, give him screens. He's a really good route runner. He has fantastic deep speed. He catches everything thrown his way. He is just so solid. And other than height and the conference he played in, there's really no knocks here, in my opinion. Looking at the Chiefs receiving core in general, you got MVS on the outside, you got Juju Smith-Schuster, who I think profiles more as a slot for them, and the X receiver position is wide open. You have Mecole Hardman, who is not an X at all. You have Cornell Powell, who theoretically could be an X, but for whatever reason, they don't seem to be huge fans of him. And you have Josh Gordon, which who knows what's going on there. So I think there is an opening to be a starting receiver on this team at the X spot. And Sky Moore, as I said, could do that from day one. I know that technically speaking, Travis Kelce is going to be their number one receiver, but just looking at the wide receiver position group in a vacuum, I think there's a really good chance that Sky Moore leads them in literally every category: catches, yards, touchdowns, all that stuff. He's a phenomenal fit, and just kind of seeing how the receiver board is playing out here and seeing all of them going over and over and over again, there's been quite a run here in the first round. I'm not totally confident that I would get one in the second if I wanted to go a different direction like edge. So I just want to make sure that I get Sky Moore at a minimum and just guarantee that I get at least one receiver out of this top 50 in the draft. So that's my pick, and I'm sticking with it. Let's go now to the Super Bowl runner-ups in Cincinnati, who are sitting there at 31st overall. I know that this is considered to be the chalkiest of chalk picks at this point, but I don't even care. I think it's the right one. Tyler Linderbaum is a perfect fit for the Bengals offense and what they like to do, which is a lot of wide zone if they can help it, but you need the right center in order to be able to run wide zone, which Linderbaum is. I know that they did bring in Ted Karras from New England, who could be a starting center for them, and probably a pretty good one at that, but knowing that Karras does have flexibility to move over to left guard, I would rather just kind of put my best five on the field and have Jonah Williams at left tackle, Ted Karras at left guard, Linderbaum at center, Alex Kappa at right guard, and Lyle Collins at right tackle. That is an offensive line that I can be really comfortable with going into this season, and even though it is still thin, like they are definitely not proofed against injury at all, it's at least a starting five that I think can hold up and give Joe Burrow time to work without getting killed. They don't have that many other needs on this roster, especially on offense. Tight end is probably the only other quote-unquote glaring hole that I can see. But if you watch my tight end rankings video from well over a week ago at this point, they can probably address the tight end position and address it with a really good value pick on day 2. So kind of keeping with my general theme in this mock of making sure young quarterbacks have the tools to be successful, I would rather use my first round pick on Linderbaum and just finally solidify the offensive line and then look to address tight end on day 2 and at long last finally finish this offense around Joe Burrow. This franchise absolutely has dynasty potential if they protect and if they give weapons to Joe, so ultimately that is my top priority. Corner, safety, and defensive tackle depth can wait. As long as Burrow has what he needs, this team is going to be good. So Bengals fans, ultimately, I know you're tired of seeing this pick at this point. You probably have mock draft fatigue with the same name over and over again, but everybody's projecting this pick because ultimately it's the right one to do. And with that, we're going to get to the final pick of the 2022 mock draft special, bringing it almost entirely full circle with, once again, the Detroit Lions.
You can call me stupid. Yes, you can call me sheep. You can say I'm lazy.
To be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure that Ojabo is actually going to go in the first round in the real draft because he is coming off an Achilles injury, and that injury might rob him of his entire rookie season. But that being said, if there was ever a destination for Ojabo to go where it's perfectly okay for him to redshirt and then start to make impact plays in 2023, I think it's Detroit. My other first round pick for them was also hopefully a redshirt with Malik Willis, so this entire draft so far, at least in my opinion, is just kind of game planning for 2023 and beyond. If we can get our quarterback of the future and one of the most talented edge rushers in this class, who almost certainly would have been a top 10 to 15 pick if he was healthy, I think that's a pretty quality first round. In terms of Ojabo as a player, he has every trait you could ever want: burst, bend, pass rush versatility, high motor. I do think that his power is somewhat average, but I do think that he can win in so many other ways with speed and inside counters. He's got a pretty wicked spin move. I think his kind of, Euro step to swipe is really nifty. He can win in so many other ways that him not having a great bull rush, at least right now, is still okay. So in the end, remember, this mock draft is not just about this coming season, it's about every other coming season for the next 6 to 7 years. And for me, getting two top flight physical talents that ideally can start contributing in 2023, that's what this is all about. I know I still need receivers. I know I still need even more help on defense, but that's what day 2 is for, and that's what day 3 is for, because to me, this is one of the deepest classes that I can remember in a long time, and there's plenty of receivers, and there's plenty of DBs, and there's plenty of linebackers that can be had a little bit later. What I can't get later is the potential of David Ojabo, so for me, he's the obvious pick here. Well, boys and girls, there you have it. That'll do it for the 2022 Film Room Mock Draft Special. Thank you to everybody who stuck around this late in the video, because I know it's probably the biggest episode of the year, so if you're still here after all this time, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you to Slater, my editor, for putting it all together. I know it was no easy task to do this on such a short timeline. Thank you, of course, to Hawthorne for sponsoring the mock draft this year. That means a lot, kind of helping to get that out. And supporting the channel in that way. Also remember, if you want to stop by the Bootleg Football Podcast YouTube channel, that is where I am doing a stream with my podcast partner EJ for every single day of the draft. If you want more context for, all of the missing rankings that I wasn't able to do on this channel, edge, defensive tackle, safety, corner, if you want to hear my thoughts on all of these guys as they go off the board in real time, you can of course head on over to that channel, watch the stream. We're going to be talking about every single pick as it happens, no commercial break. It's literally every single pick, in addition to a lot of UDFAs too. So there's no shortage of content over there if you, for whatever reason, are not tired of me at this point, because I put out so much fucking stuff over the last few weeks. But yeah, it means a lot that you guys are still here. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow in the live stream. Later.